Hey there everyone, Mr. Lewis here, ready to go through section 4.3 with you today, but first I have a very, very important question. How much would you be willing to pay for this sweet little guy? Look at him. Oh, he's priceless. Well, whatever you'd be willing to pay, it's too bad because he's not for sale. He's my dog, okay? You can't have him, but isn't he sweet? And it does lead into a very important point for section 4.3 today as we discuss price discrimination. So let's get into it. Should we get into it? Yeah, let's get into it. Okay, 4.3, price discrimination. Let's take a look at this. Price discrimination is this idea that a firm, specifically a monopolist, can charge different prices to different consumers. Thus, they are discriminating through price based on the willingness to pay of each individual buyer. So we've learned in previous units that every customer, every consumer has a maximum willingness to pay for any particular good or service, right? And that willingness to pay is determined through marginal private benefit. So whatever benefit we feel that we're experiencing from a good, that is equal to the maximum amount that we will give up for that good. And that's just the marginal principle. Whatever we're experiencing marginally, the marginal private benefit, is what we're willing to give up marginally, right? The marginal cost, so to speak, for us as a consumer would be what we're spending. So the question that's demanded from all this is, why wouldn't a monopolist just set the price for each consumer equal to what that consumer is willing to pay? Kind of like the classic line that you see in movies. This one is from National Lampoon's Summer Vacation, when he asks these people working at a remote maintenance station, a remote body shop out in the middle of nowhere, what it's going to cost for the work that they just did to his car. And they ask him, well, how much you got? Basically, what's the most you're willing to give us, because you are in a very desperate position and we're going to take advantage of that. And those two guys essentially had a monopoly on that, on being mechanics, because they were out in the middle of nowhere. So there was nobody else that could help out poor Clark Griswold in his moment of need. So remember, a monopolist is a price setter. They have 100% of the power. They're just leveraging that power. So in perfect competition, what we saw is that there was a consistent price at equilibrium. So even though all of these consumers on this portion of the demand curve that I'm rolling around the cursor over right now, okay, these consumers are all willing to pay more than the equilibrium price of P1. But all of these producers are in perfect competition. They have zero power, and thus they can't really decide or discriminate about price, right? They are price takers. They're all going to charge P1, and every consumer is going to pay P1. But with a monopoly, it's a little bit different. They can determine what price they want to charge because they're a price setter. They completely control the price that is charged to any given consumer in this market. And what we learned in section 4.2 is that a profit maximizing monopolist is going to produce at the output where the marginal principle is true, where marginal cost is equal to marginal revenue, or at this yellow equilibrium here, right? So this would be our profit maximizing quantity. We would go back up to the demand curve. Don't just go straight over. We go back up to the demand curve because the demand curve at any given quantity tells us what would the price have to be in order for consumers to buy this many units. And we already decided as a monopoly that that's the number of units that we want to produce, because if we go beyond that point, marginal cost goes up, marginal revenue goes down, and we are losing incrementally, right? So this would be our profit maximizing price. We also learned that the socially optimal quantity is the point where the demand curve intersects with the marginal cost curve, right here, where price equals MC. That is allocatively efficient. That is socially optimal. There's one other point I want to show you here. In blue, that is the break-even point, or what's sometimes referred to as the fair return quantity or fair return price. It's simply the point where the demand curve intersects with the ATC curve. And if you think about what's true there, price is equal to ATC. And as you know from our profit formula, if price equals ATC, per unit profit is 0 and the firm is breaking even. So I called this Q sub BE and P sub BE, break even quantity and price. So there's various output decisions that a firm can make, right? Specifically a monopolist can make. So you've got profit maximizing, socially optimal, or break even. What we're going to see today is that when a monopolist decides to perfectly price discriminate, when they decide they're going to charge every consumer what they're willing to pay, they're actually going to end up producing the socially optimal quantity. Let's talk about why. As we start at the top of the demand curve here, the monopolist is going to look at every consumer and say, okay, what are you willing to pay? And as you've learned in the past, wherever a consumer falls on the demand curve, say this consumer right here, where the cursor is, versus this consumer on the demand curve, this one up here is willing to pay a higher amount because they're farther up on the y-axis, right? So this consumer is willing to pay this much. This consumer on the demand curve is only willing to pay this much, so on and so forth. So the monopolist is going to move down this demand curve and charge each individual consumer the maximum amount, excuse me, that they are willing to pay. So they're going to charge this consumer this much, and that will be their revenue earned from that consumer, right? And they're going to continue to do this, moving down the demand curve. That consumer, this consumer, this consumer. They're going to charge them exactly what they're willing to pay. And in doing this, think about what's happening here. Whereas before, in perfect competition, all of these consumers, say this consumer up here who's willing to pay a very high amount, they only paid P1, and so they were left with this consumer surplus, right? They were left over with something compared to what they would have paid. But price discrimination, as it says down here in this last line, price discrimination is a monopolist way of capturing consumer surplus. They want to gobble up all of that consumer surplus that they weren't able to get before in perfect competition. Now that they're a monopoly, they can. So all of these consumers, as they're charging them whatever price they're willing to pay, are losing that consumer surplus. They're going to stop when they hit the marginal cost curve. So the monopoly's moving down from the top of the demand curve, all the really rich folk up here who are willing to pay very high amounts, all the way down. They're saying, all right, what are you willing to give up? We'll take that, we'll take that, we'll take that, we'll take that. But then we get to this point where marginal cost intersects with the demand curve. In other words, where price equals marginal cost. If they produce beyond that point, if they continue to charge every consumer what they're willing to pay all the way down this demand curve, look at what's going to happen. Let's take this person, this consumer right here. This consumer is willing to pay this much on the y-axis, right? Somewhere over there. But the marginal cost of producing this unit, if we produce all the way out to here, the marginal cost has really skyrocketed way up here. And we are not going to sell something for less than the marginal cost. That is the marginal principle. So this firm is going to stop. In perfect price discrimination, we're going to start at the top of the demand curve and stop when we hit our marginal cost curve. Because of the marginal principle, we are not going to produce beyond that point. The monopolist is going to stop right there, and that's actually also our socially optimal quantity because it's the point where the marginal cost curve is equal to price, or where the MC curve hits the demand curve. So all of this now is total revenue. They've charged every single consumer on the demand curve all the way down to this point, our red equilibrium, the socially optimal quantity. They've charged every consumer what they're willing to pay, and they have accumulated all of this pink area that you see as total revenue. And there is zero consumer surplus left over. So a couple takeaways here, and this is the last slide. It's a short section. Rules and consequences of perfect price discrimination. So one, price is set equal to willingness to pay, or marginal private benefit. All the consumer surplus turns into producer surplus. And consequently, consumer surplus is nil, right? It's zero. So the producer just kind of draws away through discrimination all of that consumer surplus. And the monopolist will actually end up producing up until the output where price equals marginal cost. They're not going to go beyond that point. And in effect, because of this, this actually creates an allocatively efficient market, which is kind of silly because the monopoly is being totally self-driven here, right? And they're being selfish in their discrimination. However, it ends up creating a system where allocative efficiency is achieved because the firm has actually increased their output. So remember, when we had a profit maximizing monopolist, the difference between the profit maximizing quantity and the socially optimal quantity is where deadweight loss occurs. And we saw this in section 4.2. This triangle right here would be deadweight loss, because the red equilibrium, or QSO, is where society wants the quantity to be, but the monopoly was keeping it artificially restricted to jack up their profits, right? But that's assuming they're only charging one individual price, one constant price to all consumers. With price discrimination, they don't have to do that. And because they don't have to do that, they end up producing here. And that has effectively gotten rid of all of that deadweight loss that existed before. They've increased their output to the point where we had labeled the quantity as socially optimal. And so all of that deadweight loss is gone. And because of that, we are allocatively efficient in this market now. It's kind of an ironic thing, but perfect price discrimination creates allocative efficiency. All right, that's it for section 4.3. No practice to go with section 4.3 today. You will have a little bit of practice with 4.3 after we go through section 4.4. We're going to stack both of those together. All right, that's it for today. Thanks for tuning in, everyone. See you next time.